Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's research launch from the CCMA. I am Stephen Yap, the Research Director at the CCMA, and welcome whether you're dialing in live today or you're joining on the replay. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It will be my pleasure to reveal to you the latest research. We're launching the report today, which will be a free download from the ccma.org.uk website about bringing the power of data analytics to the front line. This is such a it continues to be such a big topic, data analytics and how it's changing everything we do across our operations. But this particular piece that I want to share with you today is all about specifically the impact on our people on the front line, specifically the advisors who deal with our customers directly. And I'm going to be sharing with you some highlights from the report. I'm going to be sharing then a conversation with some of the people who participated in the research and who I managed to interview in preparation for writing the report to understand some of the use cases, some of the key benefits of what the latest technology that improved data analytics capabilities are bringing to our front lines. I just want to welcome everybody once again. If you would like to ask questions of me or any of our panel, please use the Q&A function. And if you'd like to use the chat function, please do as well. I'll keep an eye on that as well. So let's go. Let me just share a very short presentation. I'm not going to give you chapter and verse because I want to really have as much time for our panel as possible. But what I'd like to do is share with you some of the key sort of topics and themes from the report, which is being launched this afternoon. As you can see here, I interviewed a number of people across a really broad range of different types of organizations and sectors. It's really my pleasure to be joined by three of them in the panel this afternoon, Chantal, Pete, and Luke. And we'll also be joined on the panel as well by Rob Allman, who's the Senior Vice President at TTEC Digital, who along with TTEC Engage were the supporters of this particular piece of research. This is the report. It's called Bringing the Power of Data Analytics to the Front Line. It's getting launched at ccma.org.uk this afternoon. And let me now share with you some of the highlights and some of the themes from the report. Here are some of the brands that were interviewed. As you can see here, a really broad cross-section of different kinds of brands representing different types of organizations in the private and public sector. So I think a pretty good look from across different aisles, if you like, on this topic of how data analytics are making things hopefully better for our contact center front lines. So the first theme that's covered in the report is about getting the information balance right. And in a few short years, it feels like we've gone from perhaps lacking data to, if anything, having too much data and not really knowing what to do with all the data that we have. And I think it's fair to say that many of us don't lack data. Maybe we do lack specific kinds of data, but if anything, we have a challenge to maximize the value and the insight from the data that we actually have. Drilling down specifically into what it means for our front lines, of course, one of the biggest things that has happened in recent years, thanks to cloud-based contact center platforms, is the ability to bring that data to the front lines, often updated in real time through personal dashboards. And using operational KPIs and bringing operational KPIs like handle times, like time to answer, like wrap times, and putting that information directly into the hands of our front lines drives immediacy so that our people know exactly how they're doing at any given time. And of course, that then drives accountability. But in this environment where we're putting information directly in the hands of individuals, it's actually even more important than ever that we put that information into context. There is a risk that if you put information without context, without understanding and insight into the hands of individuals, that people might misunderstand or people might react unnecessarily. So more than ever, it's really important. And this is increasing the role of our team leaders and managers. Our team leaders and managers are actually playing increasingly the role of analysts and supporting their teams to understand what their individual data and dashboards are telling them. So the context is so important. Of course, we don't want to overload people with data. Our people on the front line, as we know, already have really difficult jobs and they have a lot to think about. There's a lot of cognitive load if you work on the front line. So we've got to keep things simple. And it's really important that any information, any KPIs that we bring to the front line focus on the customer and the things that matter to the customer. What we don't want to promote a culture of just focusing on numbers. We've got to focus on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and the behaviors that we're trying to encourage. And ultimately, it's about helping understand our frontline colleagues understand how they're doing, but also how what they do contributes ultimately to the customer experience, but also to the organization's performance. So their contribution to the bigger picture. So every organization has to get that balance right. And we'll be hearing from our panel later about what they're doing in terms of what information they're putting in front of their people. Other than operational data, you've got, in many organizations, you've got voice of customer data, so customer satisfaction surveys, which can be a very rich source of insight. And some organizations pipe in customer satisfaction scores at the individual advisor level and share that as a KPI with advisors so that advisors know how they're doing, how their scores are at any given time. And speech analytics, of course, we've talked about this, I've talked about this a lot, and we'll continue in the future to talk about it a lot because speech analytics is such a rich, deep, and powerful source of information. And when you bring that information to the front line, and when you capture information through the actual conversations itself, you can start to identify which topics are causing perhaps more challenges for customers and for advisors. Speech analytics also can be used and is being used to improve and streamline QA. You can cover a lot more of your conversations with QA with automated speech analytics than doing it manually. And when you bring those two sources together, speech analytics and voice of customer data together, you can start to see which elements of conversation drive up VOC scores, but also potentially bring down customer satisfaction scores. In the research and in the conversations leading up to the research and in the report that is getting launched this afternoon, we discuss a lot about the knowledge base. And one of the most profound transformations, I believe, that's going to happen and is happening, starting to happen with organizations, thanks to better data analytics on the front line and how it can potentially change things on the front line, is in elevating the knowledge base. Today, there is a huge spectrum and variety of different levels of maturity of knowledge bases. Some organizations and contact centers have very, very advanced knowledge bases that are used on a regular and frequent basis by every advisor. And some contact centers actually still have no knowledge bases at all and just rely on the human advisors to remember knowledge. But wherever you are at your own level of knowledge-based maturity, there is now the opportunity to elevate that and actually to elevate it and create a step change. And one of the persons I interviewed in the research, I thought put it really, really well. There's something called, you might have heard of the Pareto principle. It's really about the 20%. So there's an 80-20 rule that comes into play with most contact centers. 80% of the contacts, 80% of the intents are fairly easy and fairly straightforward for our advisors to deal with. It's actually the 20% that we've got to get better at. It's the complex ones, the non-standard ones, the difficult ones where a knowledge base and a good knowledge base and the right information put at the right time into the hands of our advisors could really make a difference. And the knowledge base itself can actually be a way to generate insightful analysis of demand patterns. So in the same way as we might do intents and demand analysis based on the types of calls that we're getting in, if you interrogate the sorts of queries that are coming into the knowledge base from our advisors, you can start to see the sorts of queries that our advisors actually need help with. And that can influence further development of the knowledge base and can also influence coaching and training. And the leading edge of the knowledge base are the so-called agent assist tools. And what agent assist does, it uses cloud-based technology, it uses automation to interrogate the knowledge base in real time to bring back relevant knowledge and put that in front of the advisor actually at the moment of need, when they're having the conversation, when that information can be used to help assist the advisor provide the relevant answers to the customer in real time. And there are multiple benefits of that. It levels the playing field. So in every contact center, there are advisors who are high performers, who perhaps are particularly experienced, who just remember and know a lot of stuff. There are others who perhaps don't know and remember as much. But with the benefit of agent assist tools, it levels the playing field, if you like, between the higher and the lower performing colleagues. But it also accelerates onboarding because new advisors, new colleagues don't have to remember and learn as much stuff. It drives consistency. So using a knowledge base, you can drive better consistency of answers when you're not relying on individuals to come up with the answer every time. And you can also, with the help of speech analytics, help better spot vulnerable customers. Many of us, of course, particularly in regulating industries, have an imperative to spot and support vulnerable customers. So speech analytics can help to support vulnerable customers better, and a knowledge base can help to find the right resolutions and knowledge to those vulnerable customers. Now, it's really important, of course, to recognize that all those things that we've discussed, while they have the potential to bring huge benefits, they will, in the short and ultimately in the longer term as well, change the way that our people work. And the degree of change can be quite small through to really quite profound. And it's really important that we prepare ourselves, our organizations, and our people for change. We have to recognize that, particularly if automation, particularly if AI is involved, that our colleagues might be concerned. Maybe, is this technology going to take away my job? Is this technology potentially, if it doesn't take away my job, make my job less interesting, because now it's not really up to me to decide what to tell the customer. The machine decides what to tell the customer, and I just play back what the machine tells me. We have to reassure colleagues about what we're doing with this technology, that the technology is there to support them, to support the customer, and actually ultimately to make their jobs easier and the experience of both themselves and the customers better. Change is a constant. Change will only become more of a constant. And increasingly, when we're looking at the profiles of people we're hiring onto the front line, actually change resilience is increasingly an important factor. And we have to accept ultimately that roles and responsibilities will change, perhaps quite significantly in the long term. I've already talked about how the team leader role is increasingly resembling that of a data analyst, because more and more the team leader's job is to look through all of the data and the KPIs and to help put those into context and interpret them for individual team members, so that those team members can go away and know what they should be doing with that data. And as increasingly we are using automation, we're using AI in many contact centers to reduce the reliance on process, to take away some of those repetitive process-based tasks. The potential there is when you take away the process, you actually free up the humans to do what humans do best, which is to listen actively, to build rapport, to deliver empathy, to ultimately deliver a better customer experience and better customer rapport. But when we've hired people and we've actually trained people historically to follow process and ultimately to follow process maps, the job is going to change. And I think we need to go into this very clear-eyed that the job may well change, and people and our organizations must prepare accordingly. And I just want to leave, before I move to the panel, I just want to leave a few questions. I don't have answers to these questions, but these questions I think are really important to be asked as we move into a much more data-led, a much more analytical future, and our front lines will start to clearly reap the benefits of this. But there are I think, some really important questions along the way. How can we make sure that when we are bringing more data, and ultimately hopefully benefiting our front lines, that we are not adding cognitive load, because already our people suffer from a great deal of cognitive load. The idea is the technology should be helping and should be making lives simpler, not more difficult and more stressful. At the same time as increasingly knowledge bases are helping to drive consistency, we're less reliant on our people to come up with the right answer, because they can tap into the knowledge base to give them the right answer. Is there a risk that perhaps somehow we're reducing accountability there? Is there a risk that our people will feel like some of the important job content that they signed up for is being taken away from them? When a mistake happens and we can point to the machine, well, that's what the machine told me to say. Does that reduce the accountability for errors? And then ultimately, I think what it comes down to is we must ensure that any technology implementation, any data analytics upgrade makes the job on the front line better, not worse. So those are some of the key themes in the report, which I discussed at considerable length from the report, quoting many of the people that I interviewed in the research. And at this point, I would like to invite our panel to come onto the stage, including a number of people that I managed to interview for the research. And thank you so much to Chantal, to Peter, to Luke, and to Rob. Welcome to today's webinar. Just a reminder to everybody listening live today, if you have any questions for any of us, pop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to those questions before the end of the hour. So welcome, and I'd just like to ask everybody just to say a few words of introduction. Chantal, hello.
Hello, thank you. My name's Chantal. I look after the contact centre at Vivid. We're a housing association in the south of England. We provide services to about 75,000 customers, and being in housing, it's a pretty complicated service area that we provide services for.
Thanks for being with us today, Chantal. Peter.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Peter. I run a global trading services team, which is effectively the customer services team for IG Group. IG Group is a global trading house offering leverage trading as well as investments. We service in about 16 active languages, and we've got 8 service centers around the world.
Great to have you with us, Peter. Luke, hello.
Hello. I'm Luke. I'm a statistician. I work as senior insight manager in the Very Group, and I specifically look after operational stuff, and the contact center is part of that. I look after a team that includes things like speech analytics and insight managers and data science and stuff like that.
Thanks for joining us today, Luke. Rob, hello.
Pleased to meet you all. My name's Rob Allman, and I head up TTEC Digital for EMEA. TTEC has two parts to the business: TTEC Engage, where we employ over 65,000 contact center colleagues working all around the world, and TTEC Digital, which is the largest CX consulting and professional services organization, where we look at the intersection of contact centers, CRM, data, AI, all of the wonderful things that we'll be talking about today, and hopefully be able to share some best practice of things we've worked with our clients locally and around the globe.
Thank you so much, Rob, for joining us, and thanks again to TTEC Digital and TTEC Engage for supporting the research.
Pleasure.
I'm gonna start off with a quick question for the panel. Well, I say quick, it's not quick, it's a broad question, a wide-ranging question for the panel. How are data and analytics making a difference on your contact center front lines? So whether it's dashboards or whether you're using speech analytics or voice of customer, whether you're using agent assist, I'm just interested in hearing more from you in your own words about what you're doing to use data analytics to help your advisors. Peter, would you like to go first?
Yeah, of course. So this is very topical for us because about 2 years ago, we made a strategic decision to really look at how we use data and analytics more to drive the majority of our service decisions. Now, this was all part of a wider relook at how we can offer customer excellence. And we were sort of all part of redesigning a target operating model for our organization and how we service our clients globally. But we wanted to make sure that we were using data for this, that we were leveraging smart technology, AI, automation, things like that. So in terms of having to be able to be in a position to do that, as you said earlier, we were having a lot of data, but it's about trying to work out what data is important to us, what's important to our customers. Expectations had changed from our clients. Our internal staff expectation had changed, what they get, when they see it, all of that. So we really had to look at whether our technology was delivering this for us, whether our processes were delivering it for us, whether even our team structures. And so in terms of actually what we're using now, we've gone right down to personal dashboards in real time, providing information to the front line. But that information isn't just available for frontline agents. That is the same information that's been provided up to Exco as well. So through every layer of the organization, in order, you mentioned consistency, but actually it's about, if I'm on the front line, I know that if I do a good job, it's being seen by the top and why that matters, and vice versa. The top can see what the front line are doing. We're also doing a lot of experimentation around agent assist at the moment and trying to work out how we can really leverage that. And it's this balance between this consistency, but also still having that tone of voice that is individual to our agents and that they are adding value for our clients, but obviously that consistency of information. It is worth me just putting one extra point on this, that we're in a highly regulatory environment where we are. So when we're looking at AI and how we do this, how we incentivize staff on the front line, how the information we provide to our clients, we deal with about 10 different regulators globally. So therefore, we've got very, very strict requirements around this. So although it's incredibly helping us, we also have to deal with that environment as well.
Peter, could you expand on that a little bit? In what way does the presence of regulators sort of inform what you do and what information is presented to the frontline?
Yeah, of course. So particularly when it comes to smart serving up data to agents, particularly in the agent assist, it can pick up query types, it can start answering it, it produces a consistent email for our clients to send out. That's where we are in our proof of concept, but we want to roll this wider. But I can remember the first time we talked to our compliance departments that we were looking to do this. Their biggest fear is that smart technology does not take in nuance, doesn't understand even the simple things. What country is the client in? What trades are they actually trading in? What are the actual regulations around that? And then, of course, that role of the agent when they're reviewing it. Do they have the information, or is it being served to them? And are they sense checking it? Are they fact checking it? What is the role of the agent at that point? Now, clearly, we have that risk on the front line anyway. People can say whatever they like on the phone to a client in theory, it's in real time. But actually, when it's been served up, you mentioned, but the computer told me that's what the right answer was. So we're actually having to assess how people deal with that environment and also make our compliance departments happy as well as our regulators. So therefore, it's very important that we do an extremely solid quality assurance on this information that's going out to clients.
Thanks so much, Peter. I imagine we'll come back to that point around the computer said before the end of the hour. But for Chantal, the same question is for you. How are you using data analytics on your front line?
I guess there's the obvious ways in terms of managing wait times and resourcing and all that kind of stuff. So I won't talk about that because we all know that. I think the things that we've found it useful more recently are around knowledge management. So we went live with a more sophisticated knowledge management system at the end of November, and understanding how team members are engaging with it and what that's actually telling us has been really useful, but also understanding where there's gaps in it. So using the data for what people are looking at to drive improvements in the knowledge articles or identify gaps and fill those gaps. But also understanding that some of our team aren't using knowledge articles because they've retained all the information in their heads. And I think this is one of those ones where data doesn't tell the whole story. And that's an interesting one to try and unpick when you start thinking about knowledge, because if something changes and they've still got in their head the old thing, how do you then make sure they get the new thing? And if we're asking advisors to always check knowledge articles, what's that then going to do to our average handling time? Because they've got the time to read and understand that information. So it's then thinking about how we can use that differently with our customers. So we're unpicking that one at the moment. Something that we've got in our system that's quite new, that we will be going live with again shortly, is our system already analyzes sentiment through a customer journey when they're queuing and then when they are interacting with a member of staff, whether it's by phone or chat. And it's got alerts in it that mean that one of our duty team, if the customer has low sentiment in a call, they can jump on and shadow. It actually sends a trigger, and that will enable us hopefully to intervene, identify what is causing that poor sentiment, and whether it's something that we can immediately take action to address, whether it is just because the customer's really angry because something's gone wrong, which, relatively straightforward, hopefully, to sort out, or if actually the advisor needs some additional support because they're not handling it as well as they could do. We're also sharing lots of performance information with our team to try and get them to take individual responsibility for their performance. And as part of that, trying to bring to life for them how their individual performance, that golden thread through to actually what they do as individuals and how that impacts the overall performance metrics. And I guess the last thing is around understanding customer behaviour. So we went live with live chat. And one thing we didn't anticipate, which our data is telling us, is our customers are starting a phone call and starting a chat at the same time. And whichever one gets answered first, they hang up on the other one. And that's just hadn't crossed my mind people would do that. It's obvious, isn't it, really? Because that's probably what I do as a customer. But having the data to see that and see how that pan out and work out actually how we need to adjust our service, or whether or not we do adjust our service to meet some of the peculiar things we all do as human beings, I think is going to be an interesting one for us to unpick at some point.
I'm guilty of that. I did that yesterday, in fact. I'm really interested in this intervention piece where you're starting to use I'm guessing a speech analytics, sentiment analytics to flag a potential intervention when if you like there's a sad face coming through. What is then the intervention that can happen? Is that about escalation? Is that about bringing in information from knowledge bases? What sort of intervention happens when there is a sad face?
So this is still quite new for us. We've not kind of bottomed out the detail yet. I think in some instances it would be just shadowing the call just to get a sense of what it is. And I think in some instances, being a housing association, we will have customers ringing up because they're unhappy about something that's perhaps not something we've got direct control of. So if they're got a problem with their neighbour or something like that, they might be that would trigger the speech analytics to show grumpy face. Actually, the advisor is perfectly capable of dealing with that. So sometimes we will do nothing. At other times, it may be that we coach the advisor how to deal with the call better, or ping them through some knowledge articles they might find helpful, or it may be that we actually accept that chat as an escalation to a more senior member of staff. But I think you kind of have to look at each one on its merits and make a judgment call based on, actually, the customer might be really, the sentiment might be really low, but actually the advisor may be handling it admirably, and you wouldn't want to interrupt their flow. So I think it is about the our duty team who will be looking at that sentiment and getting those alerts, using their judgment on the right course of action for any instance, because you wouldn't want to undermine an advisor who's doing a great job.
Yeah, that comes back to, I think, what Peter described as nuance and what I mentioned earlier as context. It's really important to understand the nuance and the context and not just take the numbers at face value. Quick question from Dave to you, Chantal. Do you distinguish sentiment from the agent and that of the customer? I think you're talking about the customer sentiment. Do you also look at agent sentiment?
No, I don't think it does. I think it just goes on the customer. I'm not 100% sure, but I suppose because we can also see the transcript of the call as well as listen to the call, potentially you could just look at the transcript and there's a little bar chart thing that goes along the top, so you can see the sentiment rating as well as happy and sad faces. It's all very clever and pretty, and I think that you actually potentially wouldn't even need to shadow the call. You could just quickly scan through the transcript and go, actually, that's okay. Yeah, it's good fun.
Thanks, Chantal. Some great questions coming in on the chat. Just a reminder to everybody dialing in live, if you've got questions for the panel, do pop them into the chat or in the dedicated Q&A. We'll try to get to them before the end of the hour. Luke, how are data analytics changing the way that your frontline work?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so I think just to touch on that question that Dave asked a second ago, you can get different types of speech analytics solution. One is mono channel that will listen to the whole call as a single audio block, and then sentiment will probably come through as a single thing. But if you get dual channel, you can distinguish between the two. So just if you are interested in a speech analytics solution, that's something to look out for in the implementation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about speech analytics because it's something that's really close to my heart, and having the speech analytics team be moved under my jurisdiction over the last few years, I felt like, it's something that I've just had the doors swung wide open at the possibilities. And I think there's something I can kind of leave everyone with is the value that speech analytics can bring outside of what they probably sell you when you go and speak to them. And so one of the reasons we got speech analytics was for compliance, because we had to. Okay, the FCA, we're a regulated business as well, came and said, you need this because you need to be able to understand vulnerability in your customer base. So we brought speech analytics in for that reason. And for a long time, that was what it was used for. But what we've discovered with speech analytics, and what's critical here, is ingesting the data that speech analytics gives you via their API. So not using their out-of-the-box reporting solutions, bringing the actual data that they provide you via the API in. You can then mix it with your own data sets, and it can uncover a lot of interesting insights. So to bring that to life, what we've done over the last couple of years is identify segments of calls where particular things are being discussed. And in the very group, we have 100 topics of conversation in speech analytics, because we have financial services, we have retail services, logistics. It's a big, a broad church of topics. And we've been able to identify individual topics where they happen in the call, where they happen before customers get put on hold, where they happen before customers get transferred, where they happen and there's a lot of silence or poor sentiment. And at an agent by agent level, we're able to see where agents do certain topics really well and where other agents do certain topics relatively poorly. And that is so powerful because you can train accordingly, you can coach accordingly, you can even look at the topics that give you poor NPS or take loads of time. And they're the things you can focus on when you're bringing new cohorts of agents into your business, because we know they're the things that everyone struggles on. So we do a lot more with speech analytics, but just to give you one example of how it's influenced how we train our agents, how we coach our agents, how we do call listening with our agents, it's been a really powerful tool in that regard.
Thanks so much, Luke. And there's a question from John, which I might direct to you, Luke, and John asks, how accurate do you find the sentiment output?
So in our speech analytics platform, the sentiment platform works by having essentially a big dictionary of words. So every word in the English language, and it has a sentiment score associated with the usage of that word. So if a customer uses the word furious on a call, that will have a really negative score associated to it. And it essentially just has a little algorithm where it nets it all out over the call and says, this is roughly what your sentiment was. That's really reliable. Okay. So from just a really easy to explain to anybody. So when it comes to sentiment, and you can see what particular words or phrases have been used in the call that drives a poor sentiment. Okay. Newer systems use deep learning to process the entire structure of the conversation and its contextual use, as well as the sort of volume of the language and the speed of the language and all other bits of metadata associated with the call to derive a sentiment score. I haven't personally used that technology, but I imagine it would be much better than using just a dictionary approach like you might get out of the box. So hopefully that answers your question. And we find it pretty reliable, but yeah, I think there's a long way to go. If you want to invest in better platforms, you might get better results.
And just staying with you for a moment, Luke, we've just had questions in from Gareth and Jake who are asking about tonality in sentiment analysis, other than just the vocabulary. Have you looked at tonal-based sentiment analysis?
Yeah, so just on that, if you have a more sophisticated system, so like a deep learning system for understanding sentiment, you'll be able to bring in like other metadata, so like tone or the pitch or just other metadata associated with the call, like the speed of the call, that will help the model establish what the sentiment was. But that could be used for lots of things, not just sentiment. It could be used for things like complaint language and other things you might get through on the call, if that kind of makes sense.
Thank you very much, Luke. Rob, clearly at Digital, you work with contact centers of all shapes and sizes. What have been some of the most sort of impactful ways in which your partners are using data analytics to help their front lines, Rob?
Well, all of the above. I think that everything that everyone's mentioned. I think fundamentally what we've seen is the shift as people have gone to cloud, to AI, as we've got this growth in hyper connectivity. We're in a position where we're able to integrate data into real time. So there's that hyper intelligent, so that a lot of the examples the guys have just described provide. And really what we're seeing is, in a world where we talk about CX a lot of the metrics that people were measuring before that's picked up in the white paper were what I think I've heard people call the IVMs, idiotic vendor metrics, where things we've measured as an industry, whether it's abandon rates, whether it's average handle time, etc., may not represent the value that we want to drive, whether it's from a customer perspective or from our people and how they're performing and what they're trying their best to do. So I think a lot of what we've seen is this bringing together of a lot of the technologies, and we're now being able to think about the outcomes we're trying to drive. How do we put better quality in place through increased automation? Because we can now, change and capture voice, we can transcribe that, we can analyze it, and we can give information in a way that's consumable in real time, in dashboards that are understandable and simple and have a good impact for both the person, the representative at the front line, or the team leader, or people who are trying to understand the bigger picture in terms of product quality, launch, et cetera, compliance. So we're seeing really that data, the ability to report, understand it, consume it, use it, is now actually hitting a maturity point that represents value for our clients and their relationship with their customers. So I think that's fundamentally where we're going, whether that's in conversation intelligence, the greater use of quality, and obviously with the diversity of channels and touch points we have now, and people calling through three or four, two, we mentioned before. How do we maintain and think about the quality? We talk about knowledge, because knowledge is important, and we talk about data a lot. A lot of the things we're seeing now, and there's a growth in, is knowledge management. And knowledge management's essential because it's really a point where we collect a lot of unstructured data, not just data that's in systems. And we have to think about that because that's a cornerstone for AI that we're working with people. And I'd predict the kind of things that Luke was talking around there is going to make knowledge even more and more important, because what we need to get our head around is that as we're transcribing a lot of these conversations now, the conversations are going to be memorialized as knowledge articles, and therefore we're going to be using, the array of data is going to grow. So our intelligence and our thought process and how we're using it, and not impacting on cognitive load, is it really measuring and driving the right behaviors? These are all things that we're working with clients on. And, it always starts with, what's your strategy? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? What we're aiming to do? Because too wide a approach can often cause kind of, everyone has lots of data now, but what are you trying to do with it? That's the kind of key thing that we're drilling in with people.
And the point about unstructured data, I think, is an important one, because most data is unstructured by its nature. And the challenge is, how do you make sense of that data and actually create some valuable insight from it?
Yeah.
So I just want to ask you a little bit more about that, and bring in a question from Sam as well, who asks a similar question. Have you any sort of advice or success factors in terms of how you take complex unstructured data and make it insightful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we found is that it's really having the right quality approach and strategy around that is fundamental. How we're capturing it, how we're reading, how we're feeding it into knowledge systems, how we're then curating that as well in terms of grading that, and then measuring and the quality of that as we move forward. I think that's been fundamental. And the other thing that we're finding is that a lot of clients may start with saying we have 4 or 5 knowledge sources. That quickly, as they get ahead into this and they start thinking of structured, unstructured data, we find that actually there's 20, that we need to consider and think about the management of that data with different approaches around that. So it's thinking about that. And that's really relevant to things like the financial pieces that people have said, because GDPR you can find yourself in compliance issues in that unstructured data world if we're not thoughtful about these things.
Yeah, that goes back to something Peter was saying, isn't it? And there's work that needs to be done to build the foundations to get the knowledge structured into the right place, into a place that can be consistently interrogated to deliver the right outcomes.
Exactly.
The front line. Thanks, Rob. I want to move on to another sort of theme, which is change, and particularly preparing for change, preparing your people, your colleagues on the front line for change, preparing for what potentially could be small or even big changes in roles and responsibilities and what we expect our people to be doing and the skills that our people need to have. Perhaps I could come back to you, Peter, because you've obviously got some very significant recent experience of some tech implementations. And what's been the sort of the corresponding people implication of how you've had to prepare your people accordingly?
I think with the scale of change that we undertook, I would like to say that we anticipated how much impact it would have, but at the same time, it's really affected a lot the way people work, the way they view it. I think you talked about resilience in your slides and the resilience to change, and whether your workforce is ready, whether they truly understand why you're changing things, and you know, changing tech itself is a big change, and there's obviously resistance to that and understanding why you're doing it. But even things like I talked about this, getting the scorecard on the front line and having it in real time to an agent. Are they ready to see in real time responses, positive and negative, coming through to get their quality scores coming through in real time? Now, as I mentioned, we've taken on a lot of grads. They're very used to multitasking, but they're also very used to ignoring things they don't want to see in the multitasking. So you are kind of having to train your front line in a very different way. Whereas maybe traditionally, and certainly when I was onboarded, you're sort of in one interaction, probably full focus on it, talking to a client, particularly on the phone. Whereas now, you're multi-screening, you're multi-data inputting, your knowledge is coming through from our knowledge management software at the same time, plus scores are coming in. So you're actually having to deal with a sort of a change on how the front line are working day to day, what the day looks like, what the day is structured like, dealing with, as I said, sort of maybe a difficult interaction whilst data's coming at you as well. Now, that's very different than certainly, as I said, when I came into the organization and what that job looked like. So we actually put ring-fence resource to help with this change, very much from a change management point of view, but actually from a freedom to go out to our different departments. So our training and development team look different now. So it's not just knowledge imparting when they're onboarding, it's actually how you manage your day, how you manage resilience, how you manage data, what you do with that data, how your performance will be assessed. All of these things, you actually have to look across your whole structures in that sense. And that's when you take on quite a big change program that it's essential to do this.
Thanks so much, Peter. Chantal, what's been your experience of change on the front line so far, particularly in terms of new technologies coming in?
Yeah, so we're quite lucky, I suppose, as an organisation, is that one of our values is around challenge and change. So from the outset, anyone joining, that's part of our recruitment process to consider how people handle those things. I think what's nice about it is that we encourage our staff to challenge and come up with solutions, and I think we try and embed that in our contact centre. And so what we're doing at the moment is we've had staff engagement groups for some time, but we're expanding that out. So we're going to have one advisor from each team who's going to be a rep around quality assurance, to feed into that and really understand that and almost be an ambassador for it. And we're going to do this, and we're already doing the same for knowledge management, because I think we all know that if you're hearing it from your peers, sometimes it's a bit more powerful than me coming in and going, you must do this. So we're really trying to sort of think about how we engage staff in those changes and really make them part of it, and give them sort of representatives that they may feel more comfortable talking about if there are any challenges or they've got ideas. In terms of other change, particularly around data, we all know that one of the great things about working in contact centre is huge amounts of data we can access. What we found is we really need to focus in on a few small key elements that make sense to advisors and not overwhelm them with the huge amounts of data that we've got. And you've already mentioned about team leaders becoming more like data analysts. There's no value for us in giving our advisors huge amounts of data, because it won't necessarily make sense to them and it won't necessarily make them better at their job. So we focused on 2 or 3 key bits of data that we think will enable them to deliver a quality service, but also a service that has the right level of pace to it. and try and link that back to our wider objectives as a department so they really see the impact that they have, but also try and bring it to life in ways that make sense to them. So inevitably we have average handling time as a target, and what we've been able to show to them and to other departments is that whilst our average handling time is coming down, which is what we need it to do, it's not compromised our quality assurance scores or our customer satisfaction. So we can demonstrate that actually, just because we're doing things a little bit faster, it's not compromising other service areas or the other things that are important. And then bringing something like reducing AHT to life so people understand actually why we have had recently a renewed focus on it. So I think I worked out that for every minute we save on average handling time, it's equivalent of having X number of more advisors. And actually that's really powerful when I think if your team is feeling under pressure or like they haven't got enough staff, actually they have a stake in delivering for the team, and obviously for our customers around that. And so trying to find ways to bring things to life that make sense to them rather than just saying average handling time needs to come down by X. One of the things we've done recently with data is actually have almost a tiered approach, and this is a change we've brought in recently. So if someone's got a really, really low average handling time, we're kind of not quite, we still want them to get great customer satisfaction, but we're not quite as strict. If someone's got a really long average handling time, the challenge we were getting from advisors is, but I deliver a great service. And it's like, okay, that's great, but 20 minutes on a call, it's just not okay. So we've said, actually, if you're going to be, 14 minutes on a call, which makes me quake, your quality, you need to be getting on your transactional surveys, you need to be getting at least 9.5 out of 10 to demonstrate to us that it's actually worth it. And that's one of the things we're playing with at the moment with our advisors, just to try and bring it to life. I mean, data's great for change, and I suppose you've kind of got the data to help you drive change, and show why it's important and show the impact, but you really need to make sure that it's accessible and makes sense, and like you said, you're not overwhelming people with that load.
That's such a nice example of linking data as well. So, all right, if you want to take longer on the calls, then we need to see the satisfaction scores as a result. Thanks for that. Luke, I want to ask you the change question, but perhaps steer it a little bit more specifically in terms of the job content and the role changing as a result of things like Agent Assist and knowledge bases. When we talked previously, we discussed this at some length, and I found some of your thoughts really fascinating. What do you sort of foresee in terms of how things will change in terms of what the front line does once better data analytics really come on stream?
So I think what I'll do is talk quickly about one thing we've been looking at doing that might influence the front line relevant to the question you've asked. So recently we've looked at, my team have looked at a kind of model for giving really consistent answers when it comes to gestures of goodwill. And I think a lot of people listening will have a gesture of goodwill system in their business in some capacity. And I think it's one of those things that is just super inconsistent from one agent to the next, particularly in the Very Group, because we have such a diverse demographic and a lot of different types of problems that can come up for customers. Having a really consistent approach to a gesture of goodwill process is really challenging. And in theory, I think the thing I originally thought was, well, we have all this data about the customer, what's gone wrong, what they're discussing with the agent, how angry they are, and who the agent is who's talking to them. We should be able to model using a neural network what the right outcome for that customer is, so it is consistent across all of our customers and agents, right? And this is something that brings up a type of ethical debate, I think, in this field, because what you end up doing is building a model that has no accountability ultimately. Okay. So when it's an agent making that decision based on the information they have at hand, if the agent doesn't give a consistent outcome to the customer, which will happen a lot, okay, that's okay, because we can talk to, say, the FCA or our other regulators and say, look, we're revisiting our training, we're coaching that agent, we're trying to do the right thing to improve the situation. But the discussion we had when we started looking at building a model for it is the model will ultimately make mistakes when it comes to giving it. There'll be a fringe use case or some sort of extrapolation that it makes when it's making a decision about what sort of gesture of goodwill to give to a customer. And if it gets it wrong, who is ultimately accountable for that decision? Because it's not the agent, really. If the agent's been served up that outcome for the customer, and I don't think you can really hold the data scientists or the data engineers accountable for that decision ultimately. Okay. And the robot will make mistakes. So it becomes really hard then to satisfy our regulatory commitments to be able to improve that element of our service. So I think the other aspect to it that really brings challenges then is your models are only as good as the data you've provided on behalf of the training data sets. So when you train your models, if the training data set is based on some legacy practices that you then want to change in the future, you can't do that. It's really hard to retrain the model. You would have to provide a new training data set. Okay, and that would be a challenge for your business to do that. So you can't be flexible when you build a model like this to answer a question. And that covers loads of situations that can happen in your contact center because it's not just gestures of goodwill. We could all think of loads of ways in which AI, in the way I've just described it, could satisfy customers' requirements in an automated way. Our business, again, we have something called goods lost in transport, where the customer phones up and says, what we ordered didn't arrive. And we have to make a judgment call about whether the customer is potentially fraudulent, which happens all the time, or whether the customer is legitimate and actually their product hasn't arrived. And there's massive amounts of data to support that decision. Well, we could have an automated system that does it for us. But again, it brings those same ethical considerations into whether that's the right thing to do for our business and not have, I think it's a very well used phrase, not have a human in the loop for decisions like that. So yeah, so I guess that would be some of the challenges that those changes would bring to our business, and it being regulated by the FCA, is a big part of that.
I find this so rich and fascinating. I wish we could do a whole separate webinar on this topic. For now, I'm going to change and actually address a couple of the questions, and perhaps I'll ask you, Rob, specifically to address these questions. So we've got two questions which are somewhat similar from Sam and from Charlie. It's about ROI and about convincing decision makers and budget holders to invest in change. How do we articulate the benefits in a way that will persuade budget holders? How do we use data as well to help influence the change that we want to see and the investment that we want to see coming into contact centers, Rob?
Yeah, I think there's a few measures that people are interested in. I think first of all, there's been this shift in terms of the role of the contact center. Firstly, the breadth of the scope has shifted, and we need to make sure that that's articulated so people understand, remember that on a regular basis. So the front, middle, back office have been linked together and brought forward. Yeah. So making sure that's accountable, understood. Likewise, the scope in terms of the functions from servicing, sales, marketing rather than predominantly service is there. So hand in hand with those two aspects, we need to consider the different metrics that people want to see and understand. And that's critical. So first off, I think customer satisfaction. Now that can be represented in a number of ways. Obviously, NPS is at the front of much of the industry. So and anyone who's an analyst, people like linear kind of progress, the ways that we can represent things, and as we've discussed before, bring in other aspects, etc., to understand what that means is critical. I think the business outputs are fundamental. Once again, this is shifting the value discussion that we have as an industry and as a profession increasingly to get people to understand what we're doing, not just answering calls. So, the metrics of retention, the metrics of repeat business are more, as we live in an increasingly online, digital, connected world, repeat business, retention, growth of portfolios, all of those things are fundamental because they're explaining things, loyalty, etc. So those pieces are there. I think the other elements is, the benchmarking. So, how are we benchmarking in our industry against competitors, against the basket of goods that form experience that are there. And then really people want to understand behaviors more thoroughly. So they may be thinking about, well, what constitutes customer behavior now, from research to decision making to buying to onboarding. What does that journey look like? What ends up in that promotion? And I think increasingly the visualization of these behaviors and the understanding can input into people's thinking and understanding, well, what do people do online? What do they do on their mobiles? What do they do? When do they pick the phone up? All of those things. And so as then really our role is to educate people with an appreciation and understanding of what the organization's lifeblood, e.g. the customers, are doing is. So I think we've got three categories there that typically illustrate the value that they haven't necessarily understood before in this way.
One theme that came through in the research interviews, which I've written a little bit about in the report, is the idea that if you take the process away from the job on the front line, or a lot of the process away, and you free up time for empathy, rapport building, the roles of customer care and actually sales and retention start to merge, if you like. And so rather than just being responsible for customer care, if you like, inbound customer care, and our traditional care-focused advisors can start to play a bigger role in retention and ultimately move the contact center from being pure cost center into more of a profit center territory. Is that something that you're seeing at all, Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's naturally happened. And I think for a long part of the history of the industry, sometimes labels aren't useful. And giving people the right levels of permission to have certain conversations could probably driven a lot of that. So, but absolutely that, and we've talked about how we enable and give people data, how we can make people far more capable in different things and different functions. That's the beauty and the art of data. And one of the things I was listening to and thinking about when people are talking about change, one of the most critical things that we've seen with change is people understanding the bigger picture and their purpose and their role and the value that they can add in that. And sometimes people struggle with that, or they may not be able to imagine or see what great looks like. And I think the more we can illustrate the opportunities that are out there through use cases or environments or exposure to people who are doing things in 3 minutes, selling this, servicing that, that's where change takes place. And the environments and the capabilities we've got now make that gap between imagination to execution accelerate.
Thank you so much. That is all the time that we have. If you have found today's webinar useful, please do check out the full report, which will be available for download later this afternoon at ccma.org.uk. For now, I would just like to finish to thank the panel: Chantal Mitchell, Vivid Homes, Luke Hollahead, Very Group, Peter Tup, the IG, Rob Allman from TTEC Digital. I'd like to thank the sponsors and supporters of the research, TTEC Digital and TTEC Engage. And most of all, I'd like to thank you all, whether you've dialed in live today or are watching on catch up. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you on the next research launch. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen.